Hello and welcome to another OmniFocus Fitness video. Today we're going to be discussing the concept of meal frequency and how that impacts fat loss. Does meal frequency matter? And if it does, the reasons why, or if it doesn't, the reasons why. So we're going to understand the physiology, we're going to go through the studies that have examined this subject, and we will of course supply an answer. Alright, so of course there's a menu system and I have my sources linked in the article below, and the menu system is also linked below, as well as it will pop up after this introduction. I think that's it. I think that's all I've got to say to introduce this subject. So let's go ahead and move on, shall we? Let's do it. Okay, so I wanted to structure this by just right out the gate, just go ahead and answer the question of, does meal frequency have an impact on fat loss? Does it matter if we consume, let's say, 2 meals a day or 1 meal a day compared to, let's say, 6 meals a day or 5 meals a day? Or even going to extremes, even going up to like 12 little tiny meals a day? Well, a few things that we do need to mention before we actually keep going is that if we're going to compare a situation like that or any sort of concept like that, we do have to understand that the calories have to be equal. Otherwise, well, it's not going to work out. The comparison isn't going to be fair for one side or the other. Another thing, of course, is that we have to be in a calorie deficit. No matter what, we have to be in a caloric deficit to see fat loss. So those requirements are absolutely necessary. And then another thing that might be beneficial, it might add some accuracy, is having the same macronutrient composition. So those are a few things. There are other factors, of course, that you might want to take into consideration. We will not be discussing them in this video, but now we can actually understand, okay, well, if we compare frequency of, let's say, 1 or 2 meals compared to, let's say, 5 or 6, I'm just going to stick to the kind of typical stuff. The more intermittent fasting, let's say 1 to 2 large meals, same calories as, let's say, 4 or 5 smaller meals that make up the same calories. So let's say we've got 2,000 calories and 2,000 calories, but the frequency of consumption is spread out throughout the day, or it's just lumped into one small section of the day. Okay, so is there a difference in fat loss? Will you see greater fat loss with one condition or the other condition? And the answer is no. You will not see a difference in fat loss from one condition to another condition. And that's where I want to leave this for now. But in the next section, we will examine the physiology and understand insulin and glucose and a bunch of different factors to actually fully understand physiologically why the answer is no. The studies, however, the science does indicate pretty accurately, pretty reliably that no, there is no difference in fat loss when it comes to several meals a day or 1 to 2 meals a day. Alright, so let's go ahead and look at a visual here, kind of a rudimentary graph that I made, and we're going to work through this together so that we have a visual that we can, or an illustration that we can understand how this comparison works between these two conditions. So in one condition, in this article that I wrote, which again is linked below, I've got 2 different people, and one of them is called Sal and the other one is called Frank. And Sal likes to consume his meals in 1 to 2 meals, and they have an equal amount of calories. So let's say they consume a total of 2,000 calories. I'm just trying to keep things as easy as possible here. Okay, so 2,000 calories. Frank likes to consume 5 to 6 meals, and we've got that difference there. So Sal likes to consume his in 2 large meals, and Frank in 5 to 6 smaller meals. So what we need to understand is the relationship between insulin, blood glucose levels, and meals. So when we consume food, then our body is able to absorb that food, and once that food is absorbed, it typically, in very rudimentary terms, increases our blood glucose levels. Now, the body can't allow blood glucose levels to be too high, because in that case, then we are in a hyperglycemic state, which is a diabetic state. Now, don't worry, just because you eat food does not mean that you remain in a diabetic state. As a matter of fact, your body is quite good at then regulating that by shuttling that glucose into the cells. So all of our cells in our body then absorb that glucose and then reduce the blood glucose levels. So the glucose that is found in the blood is then reduced back down to normal, acceptable levels, healthy levels. Now, how does it do that? Well, it does that through insulin. The body does that through insulin. Now, blood glucose levels rise, right? And then insulin, then as a consequence, the body releases insulin. And so insulin rises with blood glucose, or a little bit later. And then that blood glucose levels goes down, and then the insulin levels go down again, because the body doesn't need insulin after a while, because it's already been able to shuttle that glucose in. So insulin allows the body to shuttle that glucose, that blood glucose, into the cells for a variety of different metabolic pathways, which we won't go over. Now, that said, here we have 2,000 calories worth of food, and that food is going to have an impact on our blood glucose levels. But I just want you to make that connection of, if blood glucose levels go up, then insulin levels will be going up, or at least in a healthy person, in the typical scenario, then blood glucose levels go up, insulin goes up. So in this diagram, what we're going to look at is just insulin. But just know that if insulin is going to increase, then again, it is because blood glucose increased. Okay, now that I got that spiel out of the way, now we can look at these two conditions. Okay, so Sal, again, is eating 2,000 calories, and he's going to be consuming it in 1 to 2 meals. So, here we go. He's, let's say, an intermittent faster, and his regular insulin levels are, when he's fasted, are right about here. So this is normal, and he goes through his day, and at this point, honestly, during this time, his body is going through a process called lipolysis. And lipolysis is just the breakdown of fat from the fat cells. So during this time, yes, of course, Sal is using fat. He is using body fat. He is decreasing his body fat within a 24-hour period. So if we were to measure right here, let's say, if we were to just measure right here, we would see, wow, Sal is using body fat. And actually, a lot of studies have done that. So he hits 12 o'clock. He's still not going to be consuming any food, because, again, he's doing that intermittent fasting. Throughout the day, he's not going to be consuming any food. His insulin levels stay relatively stable. They might even decrease just a smidgen. And he keeps going throughout his day. And then let's say he eats his first meal at 6 o'clock. So he hits 6 o'clock. He eats his first meal. And let's say he consumes 1,000 calories. So 1,000 of these 2,000 calories are now going to be consumed, and his insulin skyrockets because blood glucose skyrocket, because those calories have an impact on blood glucose levels. So his insulin skyrockets and then comes back down, and then he doesn't eat again till, let's say, 9 o'clock. So he has an eating window of, let's say, 6 to 10 o'clock. So a little 4-hour eating period. And then at 9 o'clock, he decides, okay, I'm going to eat my next 1,000 calories. So he eats his next 1,000 calories. And again, he's going to see, you're going to have to forgive my lines here. They're pretty terrible, I know. He sees that, they look like really bad mountains. He sees this increase in insulin again, up to a really high level. We'll just say this is a pretty high level. And then it comes back down in time. And actually, in actuality, these curves are probably a little bit larger. They probably take a little bit more time to go back to baseline. But just for the purpose of demonstration, for illustration, and the fact that it won't fit on my graph that I made here, this insulin spikes way up, and then it comes back down to baseline. Now, during this time, when insulin spikes, the body no longer needs lipolysis. So we have a decrease in lipolysis, which means we have a decrease in that fat release from the fat cells. That being the case, our body is then storing, or not necessarily storing, but it is using glucose because it has to use glucose. Here, the body has a very high blood glucose level. So at this point, or really at any one of these points, blood glucose levels are increasing, and that's why insulin has to mediate that, has to increase as well in a parallel fashion. So then in that case, of course, the body's focused on oxidizing that glucose or using that glucose as opposed to using body fat. And this is all within the constraint of those 2,000 calories. So we have these massive spikes in insulin. And although Sal was using fat from his fat cells all throughout this fasting period, now that's all kind of mitigated by the fact that these two massive meals led to this huge insulin spike. So in the end, although he was fasting the entire time, he's still, and again, I guess I should mention that, let's say 2,000 calories is a 500 calorie deficit. So he still loses fat in the end, but during these times, during these insulin high periods, he's not losing body fat because his body's focusing more on that glucose metabolism, on regulating that glucose back to normal in the blood system. So in the end, he still loses, at the end of the day, he still loses 500 calories worth of fat, and he would lose that through this period right here, maybe a little bit here, maybe a little bit there. Okay? But in the end, he's still only going to be losing 500 calories worth of fat. Now we can look at Frank and see how that differs, and then we're going to make a comparison of the two and kind of tie everything together. Alrighty, so let's look at this again from a blank slate, and we are going to look at Frank. Now, Frank is again in a 2,000 calorie, he's eating 2,000 calories, and he's in a 500 calorie deficit just like Sal. And they have, let's say, similar body types. So they are in a 500 calorie deficit for either one of their body types. And that does matter. Again, we have to have that equal amount of calories, that equal amount of energy intake, and how that reflects on their specific body. In the end, this is what's important. The negative 500 calories, and we'll explain why in a second. So, again, we've got a baseline of insulin right here, and Frank is going to be consuming, let's say, 5 meals. Okay, so considerably more than Sal in terms of meal frequency. He's going to be more in that high frequency group. Again, we know that insulin is a reflection of blood glucose in a sense, in a almost direct sense. So here we go. Frank is going to consume his first meal at 8 a.m. So he has a small bump in insulin, and then it regulates again. And again, this is a small meal. So let's say he consumes, 2,000 divided by 5 is 400, I think. I think I'm doing that correctly. Looks like I was right, and I will not lie, I had to get a calculator for that just to double check because I didn't want to embarrass myself, although I probably already did anyways. So 400 calories. So let's say he consumes 400 calories. Now remember that Sal in each meal consumed 1,000 calories. And then let's say he consumes another meal at 12, and then again, let's say at like 2 o'clock, and then again at, 4 o'clock. So that's 4 meals, and again, each one of these is 400 calories. 400, 400, 400, 400, and then he consumes his last meal, let's say at 6:30. So 400 again. And this is dramatized. I mean, I'll admit it's not 100%. And we'll look at. I think what I'm going to do is after this, I'm going to show you what the studies have actually shown, some actual diagrams, some scientific diagrams that have a better indication of what this actually looks like. This is dramatized because it wouldn't be these little tiny humps, but it would be much smaller than Sal's insulin release. So you see that this insulin release in general is different than Sal's. Sal's had these large spikes. Let's say, remember he had these massive spikes around 6 o'clock when he ate, and 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock when he ate again. Those 1,000 calories had to initiate these 1,000 calorie insulin spikes in a manner of speaking. So when does Frank actually lose body fat? Well, again, he's eating more frequently, so you'd think that because of these more frequent insulin spikes, and that insulin, again, is stopping that lipolysis process, that increase in insulin is going to decrease, drive down, and this is kind of a dose-response relationship in a manner of speaking. So as insulin increases, you have lipolysis, which is, again, that release of fat from the fat cells, that release of fat from the body fat decrease, that lipolysis decreases. So, but Frank, on the other hand, is going to be losing fat between his meals as well. So a fasting state doesn't necessarily have to be hours and hours and hours long. It doesn't have to be like 8 hours long. It can be 1 hour long or whatever it is. And the reason why this is important is because his insulin doesn't spike as high, so it doesn't take as long for his insulin to get back to baseline. And that, therefore, it goes back to a fat burning or fat oxidizing level faster than it did with Sal. Sal, and this is more telling, and again, I probably should have made these a little more accurate, but you can see the gap, the amount of time it took for Sal to reach back down to baseline was much longer than Frank. Frank took, let's say, and I'm just throwing a number out there, let's say 30 minutes, while Sal took, let's say 3 hours. So in the end, although their release of insulin is different between these groups, between Frank and Sal, of course, having more extreme increases in insulin, while Frank having less extreme but more frequent releases in insulin. But the end result, however, is that in both cases, you still have a 500 calorie deficit, which leads us also that because we have equated calories, that also means that we have similar insulin levels. So total insulin release for the 24 hours, total insulin release would be similar. And that being the case, because, again, that insulin is related to blood glucose levels, and blood glucose levels are related to the food consumption, in the end, their body is going to neutralize that difference. But where people get tripped up is that they focus only on, let's say, 9 a.m. Okay, so let's say this is 9 a.m. They focus on the fact that Frank has already eaten one meal. And in that case, he's stopped his fat loss process for this period of time. Meanwhile, Sal, during that time, I don't know if you remember this, but during that time, he was fasted. So he had these, and I can't really draw it here, but during this entire time, even through 9 a.m., he was fasted, and therefore he was losing body fat. So if you were to look at just a little chunk of time, just look at this little chunk of time, you'd notice that Sal is losing more body fat. But if you were then to look outside and look at the entire 24 hours, you would see that both of them lose the exact same amount of body fat, because what Frank doesn't lose here, he does lose later on, and what Sal does lose here, he does not lose when he has these spikes in insulin. Hopefully that made sense. Let's go ahead and just hammer this home by looking at just one more graph that I did not draw. That should help. And we're going to go through it, and I'll explain how this all fits in with both conditions on either side. All right, so here we are looking at kind of a menacing graph, but don't worry, you've actually already seen this. To be honest, this is exactly what I was trying to describe. So here we have our high frequency group, and here we have our low frequency group. So again, if we then relate those to our two characters, we know that our low frequency group, so these solid dots, are data points for Sal, and our open dots here are for Frank. So that said, here we go. We've got our time and we've got our insulin, and here we have a perfect example of this change in insulin based off of this meal frequency. So in the low frequency group, if we look at Sal's, which again are these solid dot data points, in which case we see probably an increase. He probably ate around, let's say, 8 o'clock, and he saw this massive spike in insulin, and then it slowly decreased back down to baseline or below baseline. And you can see this kind of irregularity. Like there's no consistency much. However, then again, he eats a second meal, and I believe in this study they looked at 2 meals versus, I think, 6 meals, or maybe it was 8 meals, something along those lines. But we saw an increase again in that insulin, and then a slow decrease back to baseline or near baseline. Now, on the other hand, Frank, you see a more consistent insulin release. So again, it's not a pretty line just straight across like I showed, and that's where I was trying to over dramatize it so I got the picture through to you guys. But at any rate, still, you don't see these massive fluctuations in insulin. However, generally the insulin doesn't drop down to these really low levels like they do with Sal. So again, if that insulin drops lower, that means that we have a increase in that lipolysis factor. So that being the case, in certain instances, Sal is burning more fat than Frank is. However, in total, at the end of the day, the total insulin release is going to be the same, and we see this actually shown here. It's very similar. There isn't a whole lot of difference between the insulin release of the low frequency versus the high frequency, and that's actually seen in the data as well. In several studies, we see that there's no difference in fat loss between the two groups. Between Sal and Frank, they would still lose the same amount of calories if they had relatively the same amount of calories that they were supposed to consume if they had similar body types, for example, as long as they were in a caloric deficit, in the same caloric deficit relative to their body type. So hopefully that made sense. Hopefully that kind of put things together, and hopefully you're a little more convinced with this graph than you are with the stuff that I showed. I just wanted to show you a version of my graph because this can look a little intimidating, and it can kind of come off as if it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So hopefully with the 3 graphs that I've shown you, you have a better understanding of how low frequency, and don't get me wrong, like low frequency certainly has benefits to it, but from a strict, does low frequency have a direct increased impact on fat loss? No. Does high frequency have a direct increased impact on fat loss? No. Both of them have their advantages and they have their disadvantages that I did not discuss in this article and I did not discuss in this video. However, in the end, that fat loss is no different between the two groups. This is the summary of the video for those of you that need a quick recap. If not, please subscribe and check out the attached article. Alrighty, in summary for everything that I just discussed or that we just discussed, The answer to does meal frequency impact fat loss? Well, technically yes, meal frequency in general impacts fat loss, because if you consume no meals, of course that's going to have a massive impact on fat loss. But that's not the question. The question is a comparison between a low frequency meal consumption, so talking maybe like 1-2 meals a day, kind of like that intermittent fasting style, compared to that more bro, as they mention, or as they say, 5-6 meals a day, or really good, any number between that or above that, it doesn't matter. But we're focusing on those two conditions because those are probably the most popular. That said, there is no difference in fat loss between the two conditions, and of course that's barring some of the small benefits of one or the other when it comes to like satiety or I don't know, general preference, things like that. Of course, you're going to see advantages, slight advantages, but physiologically speaking, for the most part, in terms of total fat loss, you will not see any difference between these conditions. So between, again, that low frequency or that high frequency meal consumption. If, of course, the calories are equated, are relatively equal, and preferably those macronutrients are also relatively stable, relatively accurate, relatively equal. So that said, of course, we also discussed how insulin plays a role, and we kind of went into the physiology a little bit. We discussed how while insulin secretion might be different between conditions, the overall total insulin is about similar between conditions, which makes pretty much sense if we have the same amount of calories that are used. Again, we have to be in a deficit to actually see fat loss occur, but if we allow that condition to be held true, then we have insulin release, and that insulin release can be different throughout the different conditions. So if we have low meal frequency, then we're going to see these massive spikes in insulin. And then, of course, you might think, well, then there's also those times when you're not eating at all, you're kind of fasting for long periods of time. Well, during that time, yes, you are using a lot more fat, you are going through a lot more lipolysis. However, those insulin spikes then make up for that by actually shuttling that glucose back into the cells, because you have such a huge increase in glucose, blood glucose levels. So, and then of course the opposite is true for high frequency, in which you have these kind of small bumps in insulin, because the meals are smaller, but so you still have this insulin increase, but it's very small. And in the end, however, the total insulin between the two conditions is about the same. And then of course we can investigate glucose and all that stuff. But in the end, again, that total is what's really important. Over 24 hours. If you look at a little piece, a little time period after 4 hours, or after, just looking at 1 hour, yeah, you might see some differences between the two conditions, but over 24 hours or over 7 days, for example, those longer extended periods of time, you're not going to see any difference. Okay, so that is the video. Hopefully you found it informative. I really hope you did. I thought this was an interesting topic. I learned a little bit more about the mechanisms when I read up on this. And of course, please check out my sources. They're all linked below. They're all peer-reviewed research. And yeah, if you found it informative, please subscribe. It certainly means quite a bit to me when I see that subscriber number go up. And now that I'm in grad school, it's tough for me to keep continuing to come out with these videos, but I enjoy them so much that it doesn't necessarily always feel like work when I do come out with these videos and these articles and the research and all that jazz. So please subscribe, like, share the video if you found it informative. And that said, I will catch you in the next video. Hope you have a fantastic day. Stay focused. See ya.